"You were praying in the wrong direction," said a large man with a full beard who stood on the platform with us, the one surrounding the raised central pool. "You were not facing Mecca. You were facing in the wrong direction." "No, we were facing in the right direction," I said to him. "We were facing in the right direction for scientific imperative. And we were not praying. We were celebrating. We were facing in the direction of the tomb and were celebrating the process of burial." The man nodded. "Burial," he repeated, as if this sounded strange. "You were celebrating burial." "We still are. We are celebrating the burial of all that is wrong about religion, especially what is wrong about Christianity. What is wrong is the perversion of it. That's what needs to be buried. And let me tell you, there are a lot of other mistakes that need to be buried." "Now that is something that I can understand," said the bearded man. "But what are you burying that warrants a celebration?" "We are celebrating the burial of the false concept of God," said Indira. "We are celebrating the burials of a false concept that has infested every religion on the planet and has been at the root of every religious war. When one finally comes to realize that all that crap is nonsense, one has something to celebrate, does one not?" She turned to me. "You explain the details." "In popular Christianity, for example," I said to him, "Christ Jesus is seen as the Son of God. Some see Jesus as God having become a person, or as God incarnate in the flesh. But this is all nonsense. The ancient Hebrews had a much clearer perception of what God essentially is. That was probably misunderstood, and a large array of false conclusions were reached that spawned many different religions with a diversity of dogmas and beliefs that were hijacked by the imperials for stirring up divisions in society and starting wars." The man nodded. "The imperials need wars to prevent a spiritual humanist renaissance from sweeping across the world. I know that. We have experienced a lot of that in India. This was probably the reason why the British nearly demolished the Taj Mahal. Some say that the wrecking crew had already been assembled. Others say that they called the project off because the sale of used marble wouldn't have brought enough of a profit to pay for the demolition cost. So they call the demolition off. I personally think that they relented because they might have sparked an uprising in India that would have expelled the colonial imperials right there and then, and sent them back to their misty rock in the North Atlantic." "That's not the mistake that I am referring to," I interrupted the man. "I don't care about the mistakes primarily. I care about the right concepts that the mistakes deny. Who cares about the night when the sun comes up in the morning? One celebrates the sunshine, not the waning of the night. The shadows of darkness are buried in a flood of light. They become buried and forgotten history. That's the burial that I am celebrating. That's also what the ancient Hebrews had evidently been celebrating. In common usage, a calendar month was referred to in the Hebrew tongue as the son of a year. That's how they saw themselves in their relationship to God. They saw themselves as the sons of God, just as a calendar month is seen as a son of the year. They saw themselves and mankind as a part of the divine being that includes all life and is reflected in life. That, of course, included everything that comprises our humanity, such as our joy, beauty, sex, love, intellect, industry, creativity, sublimity, and whatever else defines us as spiritual beings. As this concept unfolds, it buries the old erroneous concepts and the new erroneous concepts as well. The ancient Hindus appear to have understood this process," said Indira, addressing herself to me. "The Hindus have developed a number of concepts that together define our humanity. The religions of India, especially in Hinduism and Buddhism, recognize 4 paths to moksha, or salvation, in which we find transcendence to the conscious sense of our spiritual being. The 4 paths are the Dharma, the Artha, the discipline of yoga, and the 4th is our Kama. Dharma is what you might call the domain of inspiration and revelation. The path of Dharma might be considered the way of the higher truths. The second path is Artha. It has to do with physical living. Here the question is considered as to what are the earthly rights of a spiritual being in the image of God. The question is, how do we relate to one another as spiritual and divine beings and to ourselves as such a being? The third path, of course, is yoga. Yoga is not an exercise, as some see it. Instead, the term refers to ancient spiritual practices that originated in early India as a means for achieving both physical health and spiritual mastery. You might call it spiritual metaphysics. And the fourth path is Kama. Kama is the god of love in Hindu myth. It has to do with one's self-knowledge as a spiritual and divine being. The god, Shiva, represents that. Some people relate the concept of Kama to sexual love. But there is more to it than physical sensuality. As we grow in grace, our spiritual senses supersede the physical senses. The sexual dimension is important here, because the dimension of sex is more a spiritual dimension than a physical dimension. The sexual dimension really begins in the mind, and the physical dimension follows behind it, in which the spiritual dimension is expressed. The Kama Sutra is a book about sexual loving that is focused on giving pleasure rather than on getting the pleasure that merely follows behind it. We have the beginning of a principle here by which love is focused on the welfare of others as the highest concept of love, or actually the only concept of love. That's my point, I said to the man. The early Hinduism and revered the Kama. Christianity did the same. Since sex is a part of our humanity, it is also a part of the divinity of our being. Islam brought out the same concept of the oneness of mankind, which includes both men and women. The God of Islam is Allah, which cannot be perceived in terms of gender. The name Allah simply means all. Allah is the all that we stand in awe before and are a part of. Muhammad is reported to have said, "I trample on everything that divides mankind from one another." The female sexual isolation under the shroud of the burqa was added later in the course of the perversion of Islam, when Islam became an empire. Hinduism was also perverted into an anti-female religion, by which Hinduism became a rule of terror and genocide in many ways. But Buddhism caused a move away from that, back to the common universal life, towards a life of love and uplifting one another. Maybe that is what Kama really means. I would even say that whenever we think of sex as something isolated in itself, we cheat ourselves of 99% of what it is a part of. The principle of giving something to another that uplifts and enriches another's life must extend into all fields where we endeavor to do something profound in our life, like endeavoring to excel in physics, or music, or mathematics, or medicine, or biology, or engineering, or literature, or sports, or acting, or theater, that enables us to help make the world a richer place. These are all aspects of life, are they not? If we limit our relationship with one another to sex, we might miss 99% of the great thing of human existence that sex is a part of. And so we let the greater part slip away, and eventually the lesser part too. That's how we lose our civilization, and have already lost much of it. Maybe the ancients had a sense of that. You give them too much credit, the man interrupted. It's tempting to think that we lost all of that. It's more likely that we never achieved such a high attainment in the past. Look at the sewer we are living in. We couldn't have fallen that low from the high perception that you are talking about. Look at Christianity. The imperial Christianity has so deeply separated God from our humanity that both have become irrelevant. Imperial religion has defined God as remote, harsh, arbitrary, and bent on punishment and limitations, and a rule of terror. This perverted religion got us squirming under God's thumb to the point that we come crawling as self-proclaimed sinners, begging for mercy and a few scraps of something good as handouts. What kind of God image is this? But that's the kind of God image the imperials themselves want to have seen. It would legitimize them as rulers of a naturally dominated people, as they want mankind to see itself towards them, a bunch of animals begging for scraps. If we ever had a real sense of God, and of our divinity, as the sons of God, Just as a month is a son of a year, we would have never fallen into the sewer we are in today from that high stage of understood and acknowledged truth. I think we have never attained a profound perception of our divinity throughout history, with the exception of a few pioneers. Christ Jesus might have lived on that platform, but no one else ever came close to meeting him on that platform, except one American woman, in the latter part of the 19th century. A few others have taken a few steps in that direction, but they only went a few steps. What we see represented here in the Taj Mahal is evidence that a few small steps have indeed been taken from time to time, although far too few. Don't belittle what has been achieved, I caution the man. The symbolism that we see here has a profound spiritual significance, hasn't it? Everything about the Taj has a profound spiritual significance. The very shape it is significant. Everything is fourfold and square. The tomb is built on a square marble platform surrounded by 4 minarets. Actually, the tomb has the footprint of an irregular octagon, interjected in daira. It's a square with the corners cut off. That makes it an octagon. 8 is a sacred dimension in Hinduism. The man shook his head. This is true in the geometric sense. But in the spiritual sense, nothing has been cut off, he said. The corners have merely been extended outward to form the minarets. The minarets thereby take on the role of 4 cardinal points in the overall 4-square design. And the same 4-square principle is repeated in the design of the garden. The garden is a large square that is divided into 4 equal squares. The larger square is divided into 4 quarters by the 4 long, narrow, reflecting pools that extend across the garden from the center of it into all 4 directions. And each of those separated squares is divided again into 4 squares by walkways that likewise extend into all 4 directions from their centers. The end result gives us a 4-square structure of 16 elements. I know of only 2 persons who have dealt with that kind of structure. One became known as John the Revelator, who had lived 2 millennia ago, and might have been one of Jesus' disciples. He wrote about a city 4-square that comes down from God as a new platform for civilization. The other person lived 100 years ago. She built a vast pedagogical structure for scientific and spiritual development onto that very platform, the platform of John City 4-square. The religion of Hinduism appears to stand somewhat in between these 2 poles. In Hinduism, the dimension of 4 is highly significant. It appears to represent the 4 geographical directions, north, south, east, and west, that we all use to orient ourselves on the earth. The 4 dimensions might therefore be seen to represent a cycle of completeness, as it represents the cycle of the sun across the sky each day. The dawn begins in the north, the sunrise happens in the east, at noonday that sun is in the southern sky. The cycle of the sun then comes to a fulfillment or completion in the west, where the sunset unfolds. The tomb of the Taj is oriented in these 4 directions. Its 4 sides have 4 gates that are oriented north, east, south, and west. We recognize 4 paths to moksha in Hinduism, interjected in daira. They are the 4 famous paths to our salvation: Dharma, Artha, Yoga, and Kama. They are evidently reflected in the metaphor of the 4 directions related to the cycle of the sun, that the 4 sides of the temple face to and its 4 gates. This associates the Dharma, our spiritual inspiration, with the north, the side of the dawn. The Artha, the unfolding of our divinity, is then related with the eastern side, which is the side of the sunrise. In like manner, the discipline of yoga, that deals with spiritual strength, spiritual power, and spiritual healing, is associated with the southern side, where we are exposed to the heat of the day. And the 4th is our Kama, that is associated with the side of the west, the side of the gold of the sunset. This means that the Kama within is the last focal point in the chain of our spiritual development. It completes an inner development cycle. But as the day repeats itself, this 4-part cycle is always repeated in Hinduism. Each part is important. Kama is the most profound stage, the man interjected, because giving love to another gets us closest to the principle of the advantage of the other, and thereby to the principle of universal love. Here is where love becomes metaphysical, where the physical manifest reflects richly the spiritual platform of our love within. You are quite a genius. I hailed the man. You are speaking my language. Who told you about the principle of the advantage of the other and the principle of universal love? The man grinned. I'm not a genius. The principle of the advantage of the other was the principle of the Peace of Westphalia. America's Lyndon LaRouche has written extensively about that. Countless people have read about that all over Europe, Russia, India, China, South America, and the USA, of course, and Canada. And the genius that put the principle of universal love onto the plate of mankind was the American woman that I spoke of in regard to the Foursquare structure. Her name was once a household word all across the world in the sphere of religion. Of course, that was 100 years ago. Now it's forgotten, but not by me. The name is Mary Baker Eddy. She is the one who brought the fourfold development cycle back into view, the north, east, south, and west, the cycle that is metaphorically corresponding to the cycle of the sun through a day. So you see, I'm not a genius. In fact, I had to go to America to discover the spiritual significance of Hinduism and its scientific dimension. You are saying that you have discovered her work too, I said to the man with a smile. I thought I was quite alone in that, together with a few friends. The man nodded. It's not a secret anymore. It's on the internet. Still, it is sad to note how few Americans are aware of the great movements in history that have shaped their country. In India we have a little keener awareness of what lies behind our spiritual achievements, but not too much either. That is why history repeats itself so often in the West, interjected Indira. People make mistakes, but if they don't understand why the mistakes are made, the mistakes tend to become repeated over and over until the lesson is learned. That is why history repeats itself so often. That is why wars are repeated. Mary Baker Eddy has put a platform into place that enables society, once her platform is implemented, to end the repeating cycle's errors, said the man. She created a vast pedagogical structure of 144 concepts that cover the entire 16-element array of John City Foursquare, which is reflected in the Foursquare garden here that we are standing in. She has provided for each single element of the Foursquare structure 9 sub-elements, 144 altogether. That's also a measure that John dealt with. It is a scientific element. The Foursquare geometry that John presented was probably rooted in the scientific development that the Greek classical era is famous for. We are standing right in the middle of this vast array, and it's linked to scientific development. However, nobody can see any of it. People are walking through the garden, but they don't know what it is that they see. And what about you? You are standing right in the middle of a historic construct of unimaginable proportions, with vast interconnections. Did you know that? Mary Baker Eddy has created this kind of vast structure that covers all the principles of civilization. Then hid it. She hid it in an outlined form within the very books that she knew would be studied by countless thousands on a daily basis. It's the same with all the countless visitors that have came to the Taj Mahal during the centuries of its existence. Did any ever realize what it is that they stood in the middle of? A few might have, or they might have seen a few fragments. That's how it was with Mary's vast pedagogical structure. Even now, 100 years after it was put in place, hardly anyone has discovered its existence yet, much less has learned to utilize it. And so, what has been discovered by her continues to remain hidden under the cloak of society's denial of it by the tragedy of its small-minded thinking. And that's the way it has to be, I answered the man. Human existence is a process of discovery. Mary evidently knew that her pedagogical structure, which exists to advance spiritual discoveries, must come to light through the process of discovery itself. Otherwise it would be useless. Thus it remained hidden to a small-minded society, cloaked under the mantle of obscurity and denial, until a new search for universal principles would open the door once more to the age of spiritual discoveries. Her pedagogical structure has remained hidden, said the man to Indira. It remained hidden in spite of the fact that she literally mandated its discovery. She stipulated in the bylaws that govern her Society of Christ Scientists that two of the most major aspects of her pedagogical structure must be made the basis for all formal teaching in that society. One would assume that a conscientious teacher would make an effort to discover what the foundation is that his teaching is to be built on. The discovery should have been immediate, but it was made only once in 100 years, and the teacher that had made this discovery, who then began to teach accordingly, was promptly excommunicated for it from that Society of Christ Scientists. Consequently, mankind's wars rambled on, which might have been stopped. The entire century after her death was filled with wars, and the wars still continue. Don't you think that this woman was irresponsibly cruel to hide such a thing from mankind that could have prevented 2 world wars and thousands of smaller ones that altogether caused hundreds of millions of deaths? Ian D. Rock countered the man. The man shook his head. Imagine a fisherman in a boat that has lost its sails and was swept far out to sea with the outflow of the Amazon River so far from land that land could no longer be seen. Imagine the man dying for thirst. Who then is at fault if he dies while he doesn't realize that the freshwater outflow from the Amazon reaches 200 miles out into the ocean? He is floating in fresh water and is dying for thirst. Who is at fault when this happens, but he himself? The pioneer couldn't give to society what it would not accept. It's like the old proverb that says, one can take a horse to the water, but one can't make it drink. The man turned to me. Did you know that Mary Baker Eddy's pedagogical structure furnishes 4 development streams, just like Hinduism does, and has for thousands of years? But unlike Hinduism, she merely outlines those 4 channels for spiritual discovery, and then stands back and leaves the details to be discovered. She provides a few hints and a lot of building block, but the principles must be gleaned through the process of discovery. She outlined references to sex, and Dyer interjected. She provided 2 such references, said the man. One is found among the references for her second development stream, that is associated with the eastern exposure towards the sunrise. The traditional Hindi temple has its entrance always facing the east, towards the sunrise, and Dyer interjected. That's reflected in all the erotic temples of Khajuraho. Mary labeled her sunrise-oriented development stream, the Christ, the man continued. She also defined her development stream in terms of the 4 biblical rivers from Genesis 2. She described the second river, the river for the east, named Gihon, in terms of the rights of woman acknowledged morally, civilly, and socially. Doesn't that relate to the temples of Khajuraho? In Mary's context, the term woman evidently refers to highest spiritual identity of mankind, as seen by John the Revelator, in the form of a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars, the stars in the crown of rejoicing. Her eastern development stream coincides thereby with what we call in Hinduism the path of Artha, where our physical and spiritual living intertwine in such a manner that the physical is redefined with the spiritual dimensions. That's where Mary has put one of her references to sex, and renders sex as an inherent part of our being. Her other reference to sex, said the man, is found among her references for the 4th development stream, that is associated with the western exposure towards the sunset, towards the golden shore of love, and the peaceful sea of harmony, as she termed it. She labeled the movement in that stream, divine science. She defined this stream like all the others in terms of a biblical river, in this case the river Euphrates, which she described in part as divine science encompassing the universe and man, the true idea of God, a type of the glory which is to come, metaphysics taking the place of physics, the reign of righteousness. That's what she has associated her second reference to sex with, science and metaphysics. That reference to sex in her 4th development stream obviously coincides with the 4th path to moksha, our salvation, in Hinduism, that the ancients have identified as our kama, interjected Indira. The man nodded. Kama has been misrepresented as sensuality, eroticism, or plain lust. But it is much more than that, isn't it? The Kama is best illustrated in the economic miracle that stood behind the erotic temples of Khajuraho. A total of 85 grandiose temples were built in Khajuraho 1,000 years ago, all of them within an area of 8 square miles, and within the short time frame of slightly over 100 years. Nothing short of a profound renaissance could have provided the economic means for this massive undertaking. Those temples aren't just made of rocks piled on one another. They are architectural masterpieces of amazing designs filled with a profusion of stone carvings and statues. And it is there, right in these temples of Khajuraho, where we find the key to their marvel. The carvings and statues are all depicting erotic scenes, not pornography, but scenes of people making love to one another. The principle in sexual lovemaking is to embrace the other person for the purpose of giving the other person pleasure, which in turn gives pleasure to oneself. India's famous book on erotic love, the Kama Sutra, focuses exclusively on a man giving pleasure to the woman. It honors the woman. And it does so in a way that changed history more profoundly than anything else that I know of. For 2,500 years the face of the woman has been torn to shreds in India, beginning with the Aryan invasion in 1500 BC. The Aryan invaders perverted the holy Vedas into a tool to force female infanticide down the throat of all the cultures in India, coupled with the most brutal persecution of women, in the form of bride burning, wife burning, widow burning, and so on. The resulting Vedic and Brahmanic Dark Age was probably the darkest in human history. The brutalizing of the women also spilled over against the slaves, the poor, the peasants, and the Negroid people. Historians tell us that this horrific Dark Age, which lasted for 2.5 millennia, came to a close at around 1,000 years ago. This is precisely the time when the erotic temples of Khajuraho were built. A profound renaissance was unfolding at this time in India that might have begun 500 years earlier with the Kama Sutra that honored the woman of society. The Kama Sutra doesn't promote rape, but love. It appears that it was this honest eroticism that enabled the great turnaround that ended 2,500 years of the darkest of all the dark ages that have even been endured on this planet. But the key for recognizing why this renaissance of Hinduism was so profoundly successful in India at this time, and why it was lost again to perversion, might be found in early Hebrew history. What has Hebrew history got to do with India? Indira interjected. Actually, all history is one, said the man. All of mankind is one, and our combined history is the history of the discovery of our humanity, and the development of it, or the lack thereof. In this sense the Hebrew background applies. The Hebrew history book, the Bible, tells us of a man named Jacob who was quite a rat as a human being, and so was his family and his children. He stole his brother's birthright at his mother's bidding. Then he had to flee as his brother sought to kill him in revenge according to his father's advice. And so Jacob fled to his mother's brother, Laban, where he offered to serve for 7 years for Laban's beautiful daughter Rachel. But he was deceived. When the wedding day came he found that he had married Leah, the older daughter, instead of Rachel. So, he served another 7 years for Rachel. Can you imagine the resulting rivalry between the two wives, who both aimed to garner his favor? Jacob had 12 children with his 2 wives. There developed mortal rivalries even between the children. One of his sons, whom he favored most, Joseph by name, was targeted to be killed by his rival brothers, and would have been killed had not one of the brothers secretly intervened, by which he was not killed but sold as a slave to some traveling merchants, who took him to Egypt. The treacherous brothers then told their father that the boy had been ripped apart by a wild beast. That's the kind of Dark Age background in which Jacob's life unfolded. But something caused him to change. The change happened when he decided to leave Laban, his father-in-law, and return to his home. Of course, before leaving, he had devised a dirty trick to cheat his father-in-law when it came to dividing the flocks. In the shadow of the treachery he stole away secretly at night from the man that had lived with and worked with for 20 years. He took Laban's 2 daughters and all of their children, and left in the dark of night without saying goodbye. Then a long way down the road, on the way home, Jacob was told that his father, who once sought to kill him, was coming towards him with 400 men to intercept him. Jacob suddenly found himself stuck. He couldn't go back. That bridge was burnt to the ground. He had no option but to face his brother. We are told that he wrestled all night over that issue with an angel. At the light of dawn the angel bid him to let him go, but Jacob would not let him go unless he blessed him in a way that his struggles would end. The wish was granted, and with it he was given a new name, the name of Israel. The new name signified Jacob's unfolding new self-perception as a prince with God. What this meant is illustrated by what happened when he met his father later that day. There was no rage and no fighting when the two brothers met. They embraced one another, and Jacob he was able to say to his brother, "I have seen thy face, as though I had seen the face of God." And that, my friends, is what I see reflected in the erotic temples of Khajuraho, said the man to us. The human face with all that it includes is honored in these temples as the reflected face of God. Indira began to smile. "I think I know what you are saying," said Indira. "Isn't that what we find most profoundly reflected in sexual love? When a man and a woman fall in love, a whole new dimension of love unfolds, a kind of higher level dimension that is above anything that is ordinary. We all try to express the love that unfolds, but we seldom find adequate words. We stammer as we speak of that love. Unfortunately, we rarely, if ever, say to one another, 'I see your face, as though I see the face of God.' Sadly, we don't say this. But that's how we feel, don't we, when the face of the beloved fills the field of our vision in our mind, painted in golden colors. The divine face that we behold in the face of the beloved puts us into a tipsy for days on end. I can certainly see that when this kind of loving becomes expanded onto the universal platform, a bright new renaissance must unfold, as apparently was the case when the erotic temples of Khajuraho were built. They were erected as temples to God, and as temples to love, in a combination, and with the recognition that God and love are truly one. Isn't that what Jesus' disciple John said in his epistles, that God is love, and that without love one cannot see God, or even know God? How then can one know oneself without love? That's what the temples of Khajuraho signify, don't they? What we call the erotic, the kama, is then really an intricate part of that love in which we find our own inner selves, isn't it? The man nodded and smiled. Why should love, which is spiritual, that crosses all bounds, not have a physical corporeal expression? Said the man. Show me a man who isn't aroused by the sight of a beautiful woman, by her smile, or by the sight of a woman's breast, or the sight of her vulva. If you find such a man, you found a man who is asleep, speaking in general terms, of course, considering the countless variations on the theme. The tragedy is that imperial demands on religion have narrowed the infinite realm of love down to the smallest possible denominator, and even lower than that by privatizing it. It appears that this wasn't the case when the temples of Khajuraho were built. We see evidence there of the opposite. The erotic sculptures weren't created with models. The artist sculpted the human life as he saw it, as it was a part of their living. I also see Jacob's transition line evident in Mary Baker Eddy's pedagogical structure. Among the 144 elements of that structure are some the names of Jacob's 12 children defined. The 12 children are historically referred to as the children of Israel. But Mary doesn't regard them, so she refers to them as the sons of Jacob, with unique definitions for their names, that is reflecting the two wives' rivalry. Mary never calls them the children of Israel. This means that the true children of Israel are those that have the kind of love in their hearts that they can say to any human being, "I see your face, as though I see the face of God." Those would be the true children of Israel, the children of the Israel spirit. It appears that the first major appearance of the children of Israel, under that new definition, came to light in India, and culminated there in the building of the temples of Khajuraho, and a bit over a century later in the building of the Taj Mahal. Are you saying that the Taj Mahal is an erotic temple in a higher sense of the term than the temples of Khajuraho? Said Indira to the man. That's how I see the Taj Mahal. I see the dome made in the shape of a woman's breast, complete with an areola. What you see as an areola, others see as a lotus motif, I cautioned her. You might be desecrating a tomb. No, Peter, I'm not desecrating anything. Nothing is further from my mind. I wasn't joking at all with what I said to you about the Taj Mahal earlier when I described it as an erotic temple. An erotic temple doesn't desecrate anything. Instead of seeing the Taj as a tomb, look at it the other way around, like I do. I'm not desecrating a tomb. I'm reversing a historic desecration. I'm resurrecting a temple. The Hindu religion is a religion of life, not death. It is a religion in which the human being is divine. Our greatest god, Shiva, draws together the female and male of mankind as elements of a single divinity, a synergy of male and female energies flowing in unison through all life, with the human being as the highest expression of it. Our mythological gods are perceived as human in form, as a means for society to perceive itself as godlike. The female form is a part of this synergy of the female and the male flowing together into a joint sovereignty, a joint rule in life. It brings the female and male together into the realm where the divine is recognized in the human dimension. Wouldn't you therefore expect to see the female and male elements to be profoundly reflected in a Hindu temple? I see the Taj in this manner, as a temple and not as a tomb. I see it as a great Hindu temple with all the essential features of a Hindu temple incorporated into its design. Sure, Peter, the areola that I see crowning the dome as a breast is seen by others as a lotus motif. But in considering what we see voluminously presented in the temples of Khajuraho, my perception of the dome of the temple in the shape of a breast crowned with an areola brings to light a certain Hindi significance that I must acknowledge as a Hindu. That I must acknowledge especially to myself as a Hindu, that I must celebrate. And that is how I see the Taj Mahal as a whole. I can't see it as a tomb. I can only see it as a temple. I see it as a temple of life through and through. I see it as the greatest Hindu temple ever built. What do you mean with through and through? I interrupted her. You mean the reflecting pools too, that you said you see as a vulva. You are serious about that too, aren't you? I'm serious about everything I said about the Taj Mahal, Peter. Life symbolism is everywhere I look. It is everywhere reflected in the design of the Taj. Indira began to grin. The symbolism is everywhere, and it is big. Didn't I promise you a big surprise? Everywhere, like what, Indira? Can't you see it, Peter? Look at the long narrow slit across the garden. Look at the long narrow reflecting pools that divide the garden right down the center. The pools are imperfectly aligned with the temple. They are a part of the erotic temple that is Hindu in characteristic. I can't help feeling that the long narrow pools reflect symbolically the slit of a woman's vulva. And everything else that I see here appears to follow the erotic design characteristic. The great temple of the Taj is made of white marble. Marble is a stone that is as smooth as a woman's skin, and being white, is as bright as the nature of love. This convergence was evidently done by design. The white marble with a slight yellow tint that was used for the construction of the Taj was evidently chosen for a profound purpose because it isn't a native stone. It had to be carried in from afar across great distances. I can't perceive the Taj in any other way than a great Hindu temple. It appears to me that whoever designed the Taj has designed it as a Hindu temple following the Khajuraho tradition, but in such a way that the erotic elements became hidden from the eyes of the Islamic thought police that appears to have been in power by then. Celebrating the female anatomy was probably impossible under the deepening Islamic rule that would eventually hide the female form entirely under the Islamic burqa. The designers of the Taj Mahal might have understood that the real nature of the Taj, as a great Hindu temple with all the sexual synergy represented, would in time be recognized by mankind on the path of its inner self-development and be celebrated. You may be closer to the truth than you think, said the bearded man to her. The Taj Mahal isn't really an Islamic structure, as most of the history books tell us. Paper is patient. The history books don't always tell the truth. The written history often reflects the political purposes of the rulers that write the history. We see this today and we saw it then. Nor was the Taj Mahal built by Shah Jahan. It has been proven that the Taj Mahal is actually a Shiva temple palace, called the Taj-e-Mahalaya. The proof is in the Badshah-nama that contains the history of the first 20 years of Shah Jahan's reign. The building was known then as Raja Man Singh's palace. It's a Hindu structure captured by Shah Jahan and plundered by him. It was subsequently converted by him into an Islamic shrine and a mausoleum. That kind of fate is the fate that many Hindu temples suffered. The so-called Islamic Renaissance in India began in the 8th century with a Muslim invasion that fused a perverted form of Islam with a Brahmanic tradition and turned a dark age even darker. The perverted Islam legalized rape, murder, looting and destruction, especially the destruction and looting of Hindu temples and their conversion into Islamic places of worship. Some put the number of the looted and destroyed Hindu temples as high as 100,000. The temples of Khajuraho were built after the initial Islamic invasion. They were built in the 10th and 11th century, probably in an effort to reverse some of the cultural damage inflicted by the perverted Islam. The building of the Taj-e-Mahalaya was probably a slightly later effort in the continuing rebuilding the trashed Hindu heritage. Carbon-14 dating of wood samples from one of the door frames places the building of the Taj Mahal into the middle of the 14th century. However, it is also believed that this wood frame was a replacement of a still earlier wood frame, which suggests that the Taj Mahal might have been erected in 12th or 13th century as the Taj-e-Mahalaya. The architecture of the temple puts it also into this earlier time frame as a great Hindu temple palace. The architectural design evidently followed the tradition of the temples of Khajuraho, but it followed it in such a way that its deepest Hindu features were kept hidden from the small-minded thinking that became cultured in India by the Islamic thought police. In this manner the Taj Mahal was built as one of the greatest Hindu temples of all times, and was built as a Hindu temple right under the nose of the Islamic thought police. That's what the real historic evidence indicates to us. I agree, I said to the man. This solves a great paradox for us in India, and I couldn't see the Taj Mahal as an Islamic structure, and much less as the brainchild of Shah Jahan. The Shah's love story doesn't add up with the evidence. Now you say that the carbon-14 dating confirms that the Taj Mahal couldn't have been built by Shah Jahan. This confirms a lot of things and rather conclusively. Modern carbon-14 dating is rather exact, as I understanding it, with a 50-year margin of accuracy, isn't it? So you see, said Indira to me, I was right to see the Taj as a Hindu temple. It couldn't have been anything else. The sexual feature of the temples of Khajuraho is too strongly reflected in the Taj's design. It was built as a Hindu temple and as a temple dedicated to Shiva. The carbon-14 dating is not the only evidence that we have to support that, said the man to Indira, smiling. His beard suggested that he was a holy man of Islam, but his eyes sparkled as that of a scientist who has made many discoveries, and a historian who understood the nature of the perversions of religion and their tragic effect on civilization. Let me ask you, he said to me, how would it be possible that a pervert like Shah Jahan could have created such a beautiful temple? Said the man. It's simply not possible. The Shah was a pervert with a harem of 5,000 women. He was known to also have had an incestuous relationship with one of his daughters. He justified it by saying that a gardener has every right to taste the fruit he has planted. Such a person isn't capable of imagining the kind of beauty that we see incorporated in the Taj Mahal, much less would he be inspiring it, and even less than that, have the generous heart to build it. Shah Jahan was known as a cheap fellow who hadn't built any palaces, or anything close to it for the Mumtaz that he supposedly adored while she was alive. Why then would he build a fabulous mausoleum for a corpse that was no longer of any use to him? He was a stingy, usurious monarch. He had looted the Taj Mahal and converted it to Islam. It is said that he even demanded some of the craftsmen to work on the conversion for nothing. He was that misery. Also, Mumtaz had died within 2 or 3 years of his reign as emperor. How could such a miser have amassed such superfluous wealth in so short a time and spent it so freely on a 22-year project for a mausoleum for a woman that had been so insignificant to the Shah that she isn't even mentioned in any of the court records in terms of him having had a special attachment to her? His numerous amorous affairs with many other ladies, from maids to mannequins, including one of his own daughters, find special mention in the historic accounts of his reign, but there was no Mumtaz Mahal ever referred to in the books. Mumtaz was a commoner by birth. Would a commoner qualify for a fairy tale style burial? She died in Berhampur, about 600 miles from here. Her grave remains there to the present day, and remains intact. Who knows whose remains are laid up in the tomb? Even the exact year of Mumtaz's death is unknown. Estimates put it between 1629 and 1632. If she had been such an important person as the Islamic world wants us to believe, the date of her death would have been recorded. But was she really an important person? I interjected. If she had been unimportant, why would her name have been used to rename the Hindu temple in her honor into the Taj Mahal? The Hindu temple was converted to a tomb, and her name became attached to it. Mumtaz was a rat. The man countered me. Shah Jahan came to the throne by murdering all his rivals. Mumtaz might have had something to do with that. She might have been known for her persuasive quality in political matters. Modern accounts of Shah Jahan speak of him as a hard-hearted ruler. Apparently Mumtaz had relentlessly egged him on 2 acts of cruelty in order to expand his tyranny. She was the 17th century equivalent of today's American president and vice president, in the way the New York Times described them, as the presidents of war and stooges of a foreign empire that wants the USA destroyed. The Times described Mumtaz from A to Z, but stopped short of using the word whore. It's not a polite word to use in a world where it has become fashionable to compromise with a devil. The whore of Babylon has become sanitized and labeled a democratic institution. Mumtaz might have pioneered the process. It is said that she guided her prince and paved the way for him to become emperor. She was the emperor's handler. It is said that she plotted the wars for him as instructed by the pimps that owned her. That is how I see her significance to Shah Jahan, a traitor secretary whore standing in the shadows, who in turn was controlled by other people of power. Would be much surprised if this wasn't the way it was, because that's the dimension of the democracy of power. It is suggested by historians that the Shah buried his whore in his stolen temple that he turned into a tomb. He used her to snub the Muslims and to further infuriate the Hindus in order to cause political friction between them. This kind of political power play might actually have been Mumtaz's idea. And so, Shah Jahan might have needed her in a utilitarian role to carry out the plot. The Prophet Muhammad had ordained that the burial place of a Muslim should be inconspicuous. He decreed that it must not even be marked by a single tombstone. The Shah trampled on this edict. No greater tombstone could have been set up than turning a giant temple into mausoleum. No greater insult could have been invoked against Islam than creating a giant tomb and dedicating the tomb to a Muslim. The Shah didn't go quite as far as he might have intended. It seems he got away with the plot by dedicating the tomb to the memory of a non-Muslim. Mumtaz wasn't a Muslim. She was a nobody. She was a commoner. Nevertheless, the Shah's insult to Islam, as great as it was probably a small irritation in comparison with his insult to Hinduism, by turning a great temple of life into a lifeless tomb, a temple that celebrated the god Shiva, the god whose name is good, the god of the Kama, who is transcending gender and uniting mankind spiritually. Shiva is seen in Hinduism as the divine cosmic dancer that combines Ardhanarishwara in the synthesis of masculine and feminine energies flowing into one. I can't think of a greater insult to a Hindu than turning a Shiva temple into a tomb. Of course, the underlying reason for Shah Jahan turning the Taj into a tomb was likely driven by his need to hide the fact that he plundered the temple treasury and stole the temple's precious contents. He evidently needed an excuse to close the temple to the Hindu public. Indira nodded. What a rotten rat he was, she said. It all makes sense now. By turning the temple into a tomb, the stripped-out building could conveniently closed and later be reopened to the Muslims attached to a mosque. And even the Muslims were kept on the sideline, so it seemed, because only one of the two small side buildings were turned into a mosque, and not the temple itself. By keeping the tomb essentially private, it could be kept closed to the public for years, so that the public would never know the full extent of the robbery that he had carried out in secret. Did Shah Jahan rip out the statue of Shiva too? That must have been there, I asked the man. The man nodded. The statue was removed together with the golden fence that surrounded it. The temple was plundering and then converted to Islam. The conversion might have taken those 22 years that are cited in the history books as the tomb's construction period. The Shah replaced the statue of Shiva with a coffin and replaced many cenotaphs with Islamic ones. He desecrated the two main stories of the temple building in this manner. He inscribed texts of the Quran on the walls and along the arches that are extending upwards for 6 stories of the 7 stories of the Taj Mahal. Fortunately, the alterations could not be totally concealed. The Rajasthan State Archives contain records of requests from Shah Jahan to Jaipur's ruler demanding a supply of marble from his Makrani quarries, together with the stonecutters that would be needed to work the new marble. The Jaipur ruler was apparently so enraged at the blatant seizure of the Taj Mahal by Shah Jahan that he refused to supply the order for marble, which he evidently knew was intended for grafting Quran text engravings and fake cenotaphs onto the temple walls. Apparently the Jaipur ruler saw the restoration as a further desecration of the Taj Mahal. He looked upon it as an insult added to injury. It is said in history records that he was so enraged that he even detained Jaipur stonecutters in protective custody so that they couldn't work for the Shah. Eventually Shah Jahan found a new supplier for the needed marble and other stonecutters. However, the shade of the new marble doesn't quite match. The new marble has a pale white shade, whereas the original marble has a rich yellow tint. However, there is an irony in all of that. The irony is that during the alteration some major structural defects were discovered and repaired. The dome had developed cracks and leaks had also developed. Apparently some emergency repairs had to be carried out, which is not surprising since the entire temple complex was probably already 500 years old by the time the Shah had conquered it. This means that Mumtaz the rat might actually have saved a sinking ship and had herself immortalized in it, and then had managed to get the Shah to pay the bill, said Indira, and left. Yes and no, said the man. The name Taj Mahal had nothing to do with Mumtaz. She wasn't immortalized by it. The connection that is assumed is actually a fairy tale. The name Taj Mahal is specific to the people that lived in the Agra region, who were known as the Jats. Their name of Shiva was then, and still is, Tejaji. The Jats have built a Teja Mandirs, or in our words, a Teja temple. Apparently the Tejalinga is among the several names of the Shivalingas. From this background the Teja Mahalaya emerged that might be called in interpretation, the great abode of Tej. The name Taj Mahal is evidently derived from this concept. The dead Mumtaz Mahal is apparently not reflected in the naming at all. The belief that there is a connection is a nice fairy tale that was probably concocted to hide the fact that the temple had been built as a Hindu temple. The name Mumtaz Mahal doesn't fit into the name Taj Mahal. If there had been a connection, the name of the temple should have been Taj Mahal instead of Taj Mahal. Also, there is no Muslim structure anywhere that I know of that is called a Mughal. However, some European visitors referred to the Taj Mahal temple as the Taji Mahal. That corresponds with the old Sanskrit name Tejo Mahalaya, signifying a Shiva temple, which it had been until it was plundered and converted into a tomb by the Shah. This means that I am right in seeing the Taj Mahal with an erotic background in its design, said Indira. Indeed, how could the Hindus avoid this inference? The Mithuna, or mating, is deeply linked to worshipping Mahadev, the Shiva, as a symbol of both the male and female organs. Is what you see in the design in the Taj similar to what I recognize? I recognize the 4 minarets as male symbols. They couldn't be anything else. They certainly couldn't be minarets. Minarets are as much a contraction in design for a Hindu temple as they would be as a part of a Gothic cathedral. Minarets don't fit in either case. Neither are the traditional Islamic minarets freestanding structures. They are usually attached to a mosque and are used to call the faithful to prayer. One certainly wouldn't need 4 of them, and they wouldn't make any sense for this function in an isolated place far from the population centers. This means that the 4 minaret-like towers of the Taj might not have been intended to be minarets at all, but might have been intended to incorporate the male element to complete the female/male unity of the design that one would expect to find in a Shiva temple. The female/male magical unity in life needs to be reflected in the temple of the Mahadev Shiva that is central to Hindu worship. Isn't all of life really God's magic that we can't understand even now? Said the man. We understand a few fragments. We see the DNA and have learned a great deal about it, and even considering that knowledge, we still know nothing in comparison with what remains in the unknown yet to be discovered. In real terms, we are all constituents of a universal divinity of principles that is infinitely greater than what we acknowledge about ourselves. The sexual element is a part of that. The Hindu scriptures argue that in order to attain moksha, our salvation, it is not enough to dedicate ourselves to dharma, adhyatma, and yoga, but that we should also experience sexual fulfillment, the reunion of the diversity of the human spirit that Shiva represents. The author of the Kama Sutra is considered a Hindu sage in this context, and rightly so. It is recognized that a single divine vessel isn't enough to carry the diversity of spirit, at least symbolically. Sexual proliferation is the biological goal in human development that enriches the whole human scene. Without it, the human species would have collapsed biologically long ago. This mutually enriching principle, of course, needs to be reflected in all aspects of social living. Instead of the isolation that sadly has become the standard of society. Individually, all people want to get away from that isolation and respond to the universality of the Kama, but they remain trapped in the poverty of confining traditions. Still, they struggle on and rebel, and some of them quite daringly. This makes 90% of mankind virtual saints in the Hindu context, I interjected. It also makes the universal festival of Kaninglas a holy festival indeed, a festival of lights and love. Surveys suggest that Kaninglas is the most widely practiced sexual festival. Indira smiled and nodded. The man laughed. I'm not surprised, he said. But this eroticism is poison for empires, and for that reason sex has been turned upside down in many ways by the numerous disciples of the imperial thought police. Islam is one. It trashed the status of woman. It that has turned the female of mankind into some form of private property, as we see this reflected in Shah Jahan's harem of 5,000 female playthings that he owned, which of course he stole from society. In a society that has developed a perfectly equal male/female balance, the skewed sexual privatization that polygamy imposes is a form looting and impoverishing society. It's a form of hoarding. Of course, Mumtaz wasn't part of that. She was a person of a lower status still. According to the evidence, she functioned as a whore. Somebody had evidently hired her and trained her for that function. She was born as a commoner. Someone had evidently hired her for whatever qualifications she might have had and brought into a close relationship with the prince, whose profile was evidently well known. She was evidently selected as one who fit the profile. It was likely recognized that the prince had the potential to become emperor with the appropriate guidance. Mumtaz was hired to become the prince's handler. For her cover, she played the role of his willing sex slave. Apparently she was efficient in her job on both counts, a job superbly done for which she paid the ultimate price, of course. Apparently she paid the price willingly that was exacted to keep herself close to the prince and manage his ascension to the throne along a path that became increasingly cleansed of many an opposing element. She paid the price for this treachery, while others profited. Under her hand, her prince became emperor, and 2 years later she paid the final price with her life. Of course we'll never know how many pimps got rich in this game. The man sighed. That's the way I see the love story of Mumtaz and the Shah. Love had nothing to do with it. Also, it's not at all romantic. This means she wasn't enshrined in the mausoleum out of a deep-seated respect for her by the Shah, let alone love, I interjected. The man laughed again. She had been used by Shah. We used her even after her death. She was used as a convenient object to fulfill a purpose. The emperor needed a mausoleum as an excuse to shut the public out of the temple in order to hide his thievery of the temple treasures. But he also needed someone to be put into the mausoleum, someone that wasn't a Muslim. An Islamic mausoleum is a contradiction in concept. A Muslim's grave was not even allowed to have a tombstone. If the Taj was to be converted into a tomb, it had to house a non-Muslim. A simple commoner that had some important background, since he had been married to her, would fit that requirement. And so, my friends, Mumtaz paid the price of being the royal whore to the very end. Of course, this isn't what the world now sees. The world isn't allowed to see the games that are being played behind the scene, because those kinds of games are still in progress. That is why the relationship between Mumtaz and the prince continues to be played up as the ultimate fairy tale love romance, a fairy tale that wraps up the Taj within a glittering veil of mystery, in the hope that the truth remains hidden forever. All empires fear that kind of truth, especially Trey, as it would expose today's global imperial games and the numerous layers of prostitution that is going on, with layers upon layers of hidden pimps. The Spanish painter Francisco Goya understood the game well, I interjected. His famous piece, Magius on a Balcony, gives us a hint of how the game was played in his time, which has intensified since then, but has not basically changed. The imperial games are bigger today, much bigger. It's no longer about the fate of temples and putting a prince into power. It's about the fate of nations, continents, and mankind as a whole. Sure, the imperial oligarchs still run their Google of pimps that own countless whores of the Mumtaz variety, who masquerade as presidents and advisors to presidents, but the goal now is to destroy nations for the pleasure of the empire. The American presidency has been taken over by hired whores for the goal of destroying the USA in order to pave the way to the power of an oligarchic world empire. The British Empire had always aimed to become the world empire. The USA was founded to prevent that, and has so far prevented it, but it has been targeted for destruction from the day it was born. Right now the USA is being destroyed from within by the hired whores of the empire that the empire financed into power. This process is far advanced. The war and terror that is ripping the Middle East apart has nothing to do with the Middle East directly. It's a grand game of whores that are deployed to draw the USA into an imperial trap for the purpose of destroying the one nation that has hindered the old financial oligarchy from achieving its world empire goals. As in the case of Mumtaz, who paid the ultimate price, the modern whores, whether they are countries, presidents, legislatures, religions, or tribal interests, will all be sacrificed in the process, and if possible even be abused even after their death. For as long as there have been empires, there have been pimps and whores that do the oligarch's bidding, said the man. That's why empires exist. That is what we need to bury, and will bury, I said to him. That's why I face the tomb in celebration of what will be buried. For 4,000 years the world has been at war, dying under the thumb of the empires. The greatest pioneers of mankind have fought to overthrow the process of empire, and have so far failed. But it is foolish to say that this victory over war, this victory over empire, cannot be won. I say it can be won. I am celebrating it. The fault for this failure lies not with the empire, but with society, and society can be uplifted. I am celebrating the inevitable burial of empire on the path of human development. I am fighting for this burial right now by putting all my weight into the process of overturning the self-isolation of mankind from its humanity and from one another, politically, socially, even sexually, all the way down to the grassroots. The man nodded. I was impressed by your recognition of the Taj as a temple for burial, he said. The Taj is significant as a tomb because within the walls of this tomb the truth lies deeply buried, while what defies the truth should be buried. The imperials know that the truth must remain buried in order to keep the imperial system alive. Mumtaz would have understood this. But you saw the tomb in a different light, didn't you? You saw it as representing the burial of lies, the burial of all that is false. You saw it as a symbol of the inevitable burial of the imperial system and its inhumanity, its thievery, its fascism, its wars, and the burial of all the whoremongering that had victimized Mumtaz and had destroyed her life just as it is destroying so much of society and civilization today. All of that needs to be buried. It needs to be buried now. There are too many victims like Mumtaz in the world today. But the burial of lies is not the function of a tomb. It is the function of a temple. You were kneeling before the tomb while you should have been dancing in the temple. Remember, the function of a tomb is to bury the truth, whereas the function of a temple is to bury all the lies in the world with the truth. You will never find a whore in a temple, metaphorically speaking, but you'll find the crowded around the tomb. I know a great many whores crowding the great tombs of today, the houses of doom, I interrupted the man. Our halls of government are filled with whores by the droves, and not only in the Senate and the Congress, that have become houses of doom. I can see the Mumtaz in many disguises. And I can also see the pimps that own her, pimps in fine suits living in glass towers of corporations, who themselves are owned by other and ever more hidden pimps running a game from the shadows, even as the game in the shadows foreshadows a new dark age. This means that the world might not be mistaken when it calls the Taj Mahal the greatest temple to love ever built, said Indira. I didn't suggest that the world was mistaken in that regard, said the man. The grand title that has been given to the Taj Mahal is still true. The Taj Mahal is the greatest temple to love ever built. Nothing disputes that. This feature is built into its design as a temple. The age of the Chandela temples of Khajuraho might have been past when the Taj Mahal was being built in the 12th century, but the age of the temple that unites all mankind in truth had not ended, and it hasn't ended to the very day. The Taj Mahal symbolizes the features of the living temple. The great renaissance of the Shiva type of erotic worshipping, like in Khajuraho, might have been waning in the 12th century, and the Islamic age might have been on the rise in which the male and female unity was once again split apart, but the spiritual eroticism of the temples of Khajuraho was maintained in the Taj Mahal. The builder of the Taj Mahal, which is known today as simply the Taj Mahal, appears to have retained in a hidden manner the core of the Shiva worship of the earlier Renaissance. The temples of Khajuraho are reflected here in the Taj. The core ideal of the Hindu temple had not been erased. It was brought out by building the greatest temple to love that has ever been built on our planet, in the form of honoring the truth of the Shiva-type love that unites the female and male into one. The truth comes to light in the Taj only when we begin to dig deeper into our love for our humanity. It seems as if the builder had foreseen that the Shiva temple could and would be desecrated in future ages, before its significance would be rediscovered. So the builders built a temple that could endure, that could not really be desecrated no matter how many elements within it would be plundered, or be destroyed, or be plastered over with new marble plates emblazoned with foreign texts. For as long as the structure itself would remain standing, its Shiva significance would remain standing tall and unaltered. Thus the builders created a building and a garden in front of the building in such a manner that both of them could be recognized as giant erotic sculptures in their entirety. Thus the dome remains standing to the present day in the shape of a woman's breast, and the garden below it remains in the shape of a vulva with the minarets, and the domed corners of the temple representing the male element surrounding the female breast. The Taj Mahal is thereby clearly the greatest temple to Shiva, and the principle of the divine eroticism that has ever been built, whereby it is also the greatest temple to love that has ever been built. None of the erotic temples of Khajuraho come even close in their majesty and their eroticism in comparison with the symbolism of the Taj Mahal. The Taj is eroticism in the extreme. It is the kind of eroticism that one not just merely looks at, as in the case of the temples of Khajuraho. Instead, it is huge. It is a kind of eroticism that one stand in the middle of and become a part of, that looms high above one and spreads out beneath one's feet. The Taj Mahal was never meant to be a temple of the Romeo and Juliet type of love. This love story is a fairy tale that never was true, but which is told again and again to every visitor that comes to this place. The visitors are all lied to in order to hide the tragedies of the great treacheries that were committed here. Compared with deepest the romantic type of love, the Shiva love goes deeper. It goes to the heart of a renaissance that might yet save our civilization, and with it save the existence of mankind in the atomic age of the fourth generation. Can you think of a greater love than that? Can you think of a greater temple to that love than the Taj Mahal? Can you think of a greater tragedy than that of keeping this love hidden? I shook my head and said no, and Indira likewise. Be cautious, said the man. I can't think of something that might qualify as something greater. It is a temple that has become a profound science, called divine science, by its discoverer. The discoverer is Mary Baker Eddy. Her temple is a pedagogical structure that takes one through 4 development streams into the development of divine science. As I said earlier, Mary includes 2 references to sex that have at their core the male and female unity, the synthesis of masculine and feminine energies and qualities into one, designed for enriching one another. She refers to a higher form of temple, a mental monument, a superstructure high above the work of men's hands, even the outcome of their heart, giving to the material a spiritual significance, love catching a glimpse of glory. But Mary also retained some of the features of a great physical temple, as for example the geographical orientation, I interjected. I understand that the Hindu temples are typically oriented with their entrance to the east, towards the sunrise. Mary utilized this concept of geography's orientation relative to the run, and created a pedagogical structure that she said is oriented to the north, east, south, and west, in that order. The order accords with the orientation of the sun in the cycle of a day. The dawn begins in the north, the sunrise unfolds in the east, the heat of the noonday comes from the south, and at the end of the day the golden sunset unfolds in the west. The Taj Mahal temple is built facing in all 4 of these directions, with the southern exposure also facing the Great Garden. The builders of the Taj Mahal thereby placed the Volta symbolism right into the open and attached it to the side that is oriented to the noonday sun. The builders obviously weren't intending to hide anything, I interjected. They were intending to celebrate something that they felt is profound, said Indira. Indeed, one has to stand in the middle of the garden to recognize that the dome of the temple is made in the shape of a breast. The northern exposure of the Taj is facing the river, said the man. The river is important in Hinduism. It signifies the dawn of civilization, which began at the Indus River. Mary Baker Eddy called her River of the Dawn, Pisan, which is the first river mentioned in Genesis 2. She defined that river as the love of the good and beautiful and their immortality. Isn't that kind of love, which is rooted in our recognition of all that is good and beautiful, the essence of our humanity? This essence is what sets us apart from every other living species. It is also what assures our immortality, because without it our world is doomed and mankind is doomed to become extinct by the power of its modern weaponry that has created a killing machine, which when unleashed, no life can survive, and no one can hide from or escape from. The total extinction of all life is an element that the ancient Hindus didn't need to consider, but which is paramount today, I interjected. That is probably the reason why Mary chose the cycle of the day to identify her 4 development streams with, because this continuing cycle of the day takes us back again and again to the dawn of civilization that is still unfolding. The dawn signifies that we work ourselves out of the imperial nightmare of horrid dreams, murderous looting and fascism, and wars that have nothing to do with civilization and human living. I would say that this sounds reasonable, said the man. The east, of course, is the sunrise. And I think we are in the sunrise to some degree. The process has begun. Mary called her sunrise River Gihon, and in defining it she told us that the sunrise represents the rights of woman acknowledged morally, civilly, and socially. We cannot say that we have a civilization unfolding until this happens, but to get there we have to develop a new image for mankind. And that's the challenge Mary is posing with her description of the river. I interrupted the man. I find myself reminded that John the Revelator, who foresaw the end of all evil and wrote Apocalypse to document his vision, foresaw that new face of mankind as a woman clothed with the sun. I interjected. I think he foresaw a spiritual image of mankind in which the gender division disappears into a grand union of the good and the beautiful. I think this movement has already begun. Shiva represents this union in early Hinduism. Mary added her own eroticism in her own hidden style, similar to what we see here at the Taj. Mary gives us the image of an old woman in a rocking chair wearing a crown of thorns, representing the science of the Christ that everyone mocks, and that theology has turned its back to. The old woman has her hand on a cane. The scene is painted in such a way that it seems her hand grasped the genitals of a boy standing beside her, who is intensely alive and is reaching with a book in hand to an old man representing theology. The old man representing theology has his back turned to science. He faces the masses of society, whom he keeps in his spell, lifeless, as if they were all asleep. That's the sunrise. The boy being grabbed at his genitals as it were by a woman representing science is living in the sunrise, and his face shows it. He is alive, as if his face was clothed with the sun. Mary labeled this development stream, the Christ. But that's the same that we celebrate in Hinduism, and I interrupted. The scene of woman symbolically grasping the boy's genitals reflects as much the Hindu-recognized synergy of the female and male energies of mankind, the joint rule of the female and male, the joint sovereignty, as it also expressed in that scene, as the synergy of science and human creativity, or vitality. Mary thereby acknowledges an element that we have seen and celebrated in Hinduism for a long time. But she doesn't leave it at that, I interjected. She takes the synergy a step further where it reflects the actual renaissance of science and the spontaneous vitality of creativity. A renaissance is not a dead thing, but an active thing, a symphony composed of science and creativity that uplifts the earth. A renaissance is the synergy of the spiritual dimension of mankind and its physical expression. That is what makes us human beings. That's where we find out humanity. If that synergy of the human and the divine doesn't illustrate the function of the Christ, what does? Science is a divine element of our humanity by virtue of our human intelligence, which is divine. Intelligence is divine because it is infinitely greater than anything that has ever been made with men's hands, or is the outcome of our hearts. Science exists because intelligence exists. That's the divine Kama, the Artha, the real wealth of humanity, the created wealth. The Hindu divine Kama sets the stage. It illustrates the principle of the synergy of the human and the divine, of the sexual and the spiritual, of the female and male energies flowing together in caring and providing. I think the point is that the concept of the divine Kama as Artha has a wide range and no real limits, said the man. Obviously the self-development of mankind is still going on. We rise spiritually from a boundless basis into a rich human future. The female and male synergy that is celebrated in Hinduism as a basis for the Kama is still as valid today than it has ever been, but only as a starting point, not as a circumference. I see it as a threshold to the infinite. Society's female and male marriage into a singularity of two reflects a starting point in the Kama synergy without a circumference or a boundary. It reflects a principle, and a principle has no boundary. A principle can have boundless expressions, and that is the source of our wealth that we create as human beings. Our artha is the freedom from limits that we experience as our living patterns the divine. The artha is found in the synergy of science flowing together with human vitality and creativity, and everything that flows from it. And so the first step in Hindu recognition expands again, I added. It expands into a boundless marriage platform as science brings a new vitality to the social synergy of mankind. It takes the female and male synergy and its synergy of caring and enriching onto the wider universal platform that enlarges the singularity of two with a sense of the universality of mankind as human beings existing side by side in their unity of joint sovereignty, bound by countless strands of love. I would say that this needs to be celebrated, said the man. Prayer becomes celebration. Isn't that a part of the forever ongoing sunrise? The sunrise happens in the east, said Indira. That is probably why all Hindu temples have their entrance facing east. So there is a connection, isn't there, between ancient Hinduism, that is still valid, and the modern leading edge of scientific thinking that reflects ever more of what is rooted in universal principle, or divine principle. The man nodded. The bigger challenge, however, lies in the south, he continued. That's where we deal with the quantum jump in the demands that the natural synergy has put on the table. In the southern direction, the Taj puts the vulva on the table. That is also from where the entire complex female and male synergy is brought into a single view. Are we ready for the energy of the synergy in today's world? I don't think we are. Our world has become a world of poverty and denial. Eroticism has become rape. Rape has become war has become extermination. Where do we see the synthesis of the masculine and feminine energies, flowing into the synergy of a higher truth that is exploding with the dynamism of life and profound celebrations? We don't see any of that anywhere. We see division, isolation, privatization, exploitation, domination. The whole sexual scene has become imperialized. A great deal of healing is needed in the southern scene. The vulva is where mankind gets together, even most intimately. Unfortunately, this place where mankind meets in truth all across the board, and across all nations from the pauper to the king, remains covered with obscurity and hidden in privatization so that the universal unity of mankind remains unacknowledged, much less understood. We need the same kind of profound healing that might have been experienced for a brief span at the Renaissance of the turn of the millennium, where the universal synergy of the female and male elements that flows in Hindu mythology created a Hindu Renaissance in which the temples of Khajuraho were built. While that Renaissance was short-lived, I think it was the start of the kind of profound Renaissance that Mary refers to when she defined her third river, Hiddekel, as divine science understood and acknowledged. I don't think Mary had any specific Renaissance in mind, much less the one in which the temples of Khajuraho were built, I interjected. She labeled her southern river Christianity and associated it with a cross of Calvary that binds human society into solemn union. We are still facing this challenge today, aren't we? Said the man. If we fail to raise our Christianity, or more correctly our innate universal humanity, to a dramatically higher spiritual level, where we recognize ourselves universally as human beings of a single humanity, Calvary will be our collective future. We are already heading that way with our pockets filled with atom bombs. We are wielding fourth-generation nuclear bombs now, I interjected. We started with a simple atom bomb. The next generation was the H-bomb, 10,000 times bigger in destructive force. The third generation was the neuron bomb, that only kills people but leaves the cities intact to be reused. The fourth generation atomic bomb is the dirty uranium bomb, that pollutes the world with radioactive manometer-sized particles that fill the air we breathe. We have built them by the tens of millions already. That's how we get rid of nuclear waste. We put it into bombs that are designed to kill people slowly over long periods, wrecking the human DNA. These bombs, once dropped, will keep on killing forever. Also, there is no place that one could go to where one could hide from the deadly effects of those bombs once the very air is poisoned with radiation. That's where we stand today, I said to the man. This is not something we might get into. The bombs are already built. They are sitting on the ground. The radiation that is presently polluting the world from the few bombs that have been used so far against Iraq, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, and Lebanon is already causing multiple increases in cancers and a worldwide epidemic in diabetes. Now we face the policy on intention to increase that silent killing spree 100-fold. That is what happens when society loses its humanity. Our very existence is hanging by a thread. Who will save us when this last thread breaks, and our prepared for self-imposed fate overtakes us? I hear you, said the man. But the symbol of the cross of Calvary is not the symbol of the fate that mankind cannot escape, the man interjected. It stands as a symbol of power that mankind has, which is rooted in our humanity as human beings. The cross of Calvary stands as a symbol of the power we all have to step away from this fate. Christ Jesus stepped away from the cross. He demonstrated that the cross has no power. He didn't run away from it, but he stepped away from it in resurrection. He demonstrated for all times that mankind has the power to undergo a resurrection and become human beings in the fullest divine sense. This means that we have the power to assume a new face, the power to step up to a higher level of civilization, and the power to truly experience the wonders of our humanity. That's what binds human society into solemn union. The Hindu synergy of the female and male energies of mankind flowing into one comprehensive divine manifest put us on the road to the fuller realization of the principle of universal love, or divine love. I think we have no choice but to learn scientifically to become human beings and build our civilization along this road. I cannot imagine how it is possible that people still think that a human civilization can be built on a heap of bombs, Indira interjected. I think this is also the ancient challenge of Shiva, isn't it? Said the man. A deeply scientific Hindu might say, I cannot imagine how it is possible that people still think that a human civilization can be built on the universal division and isolation of mankind from one another. Can people realize that they thereby isolate themselves from their own humanity and from their God? The same goes for the scientific Christian, who should be appalled at division and isolation that is practiced. He should point to the declaration of John that God is love, and that without love one cannot see God. But what's the practice in Christianity? The practice is that love is okay for as long as it isn't demanded to reach outside of our marriage boundary, our political ideology, our private wealth, our ethnic class, our sexual preference, our religion, our national ambition, our business allegiance, our military power, and so forth. That's why love has become so small that the world is completely open to bullets and bombs and imperial looting and domination. Hobbes said, go even further in that direction, and don't love at all, love is treason. But the fact doesn't change that without love civilization collapses into a Hobbesian black hole that destroyed half the population of Europe in the 30 Years' War, and this the hard way, without nuclear bombs. The challenge is to get out of the trap. No, the challenge is bigger, I countered the man. During the 30 Years' War the challenge was to win the war against war. This challenge was met with the principle in 1648, and the Peace of Westphalia resulted. The next bigger challenge was to win the war against empire as a world order. The founding of the USA was a step in that direction, but the war against empire was never won. To the contrary, the USA became a part of the empire world order. Winning this war has become a huge challenge because, without a decisive victory on this front, mankind cannot survive economically, nor survive the voracity of the imperial killing machine that now wields fourth-generation atomic weaponry. But the biggest challenge of them all is to achieve a victory over our smallness that had bottled up our love and is destroying it. All the other victories that we must win depends on us winning this victory over our smallness that is destroying our love. The Hindu knows this, and so does the Christian. The Hindu yogi is committed to this path, Indira interjected. Mary mapped out the path scientifically, I said to the man. The man nodded and smiled. So, tell me about Mary's scientific development stream of the West. He said to me, Mary described the western exposure, the sunset exposure, as being oriented towards the grand realization of the golden shore of love and the peaceful sea of harmony. Tell me about it. What does this mean to you? The fourth path to moksha, in which we attain our salvation, is evidently the path of Kama, said Indira. Kama means that we fully experience our humanity, and not just theoretically, nor by simply trying, but that we do so with all our heart and soul, and our being. This means that Kama is not just a sexual thing, but is primarily a spiritual celebration. I think the key here is celebration, a celebration of the union of the human and the divine. Mary labeled her fourth development river, Euphrates. I interjected. The river Euphrates is that of the fourth river listed in Genesis 2. It's just listed there without an explanation. It is listed as one of the four rivers of civilization. It was once believed that civilization had its first beginning in the river valley of Mesopotamia. But Mary gives this fourth river, that is merely mentioned in scriptures, a huge definition. She defines it as divine science encompassing the universe and man, the true idea of God, a type of the glory which is to come, metaphysics taking the place of physics, the reign of righteousness. However, contrary to one's expectation, she doesn't go as far as lifting the spiritual out of the human context, where we live, and where we are able to experience the spiritual dimension in human terms. And so she goes on and defines the river further in down-to-earth human terms, by describing it also as the atmosphere of human belief, a state of mortal thought, the only error of which is limitation, finity, the opposite of infinity. She really holds the spiritual and the human dimension together in a scientific balance. Thus she calls the development stream for this process divine science. Isn't that what the Kama ultimately represents in Hinduism, the union of the human and the divine, with all aspects of this union being experienced profoundly in daily living? Starting with a universal synergy of the female and male energies, flowing together. That profound union has been broken apart by the perversion of religion, that every religion has become subjected to, said the man. In Christianity, the Adam mythology was invented for the task. Mary describes it in two parts. One part represents mankind's self-denial as a divine being. The second part represents mankind's denial of God, to the point that God disappeared in the atheism of matter. The second part represents the kind of trashing of God that we have been challenged to deal with in Mary's fourth development stream, or the fourth path, that the Hind calls Kama, I interjected. That's the path that deals with our smallness, that needs to be overcome scientifically for love to unfold. If there is no God, no universal principle, no truth, no love, no universal soul, and no spirit manifest in our humanity, what have we got left then for us to experience of our divine nature? In fact, what have we got without it to build a civilization with? We have a divine mind that enables us to understand principles that no eye can see, to recognize truth, to feel the passion of love, to experience the profound universal soul that makes us all human, and vastly more capable than any other species of life that we know. If we deny all of that, what have we got left? We are capable of a spirit that is divine, that enables us to stand on the noon, to explore the stars, and to upgrade the earth into a cradle of infinite resources with such riches that the future ice ages won't have dominion over us. These are the riches of our humanity that we are challenged to experience in life. That's the real Kama, isn't it? Said Indira. The man nodded and smiled. And that is what we find in Mary's second sexual scene, the one that she located in the sunset development stream, the golden stream of love labeled divine science, I said to the man. Mary gives us the scene of a woman in white robes, clothed with sun, as it were. The woman grabs the clapper of a door knocker to the mansion of humanity. Through a window we can see into the mansion. We see mankind in pairs. Some dancing. Some drinking, a boy and girl looking out. They are always in pairs. The title of the scene is Truth versus Error. But the door knocker is made in the shape of a human being with its hands folded in front in such a way that the folded hands hit where the genitals would be. That's where the woman grabs the door knocker and knocks. But the scene is more profound than that. The woman stands in the middle of two concentric squares. The resulting arrangement gives us a construction of 9 sub-elements, which when they are applied to all of the 16 elements of her pedagogical structure, invites us to raise our exploration onto the resulting 144-element platform, as 9 times 16 equals 144. This resulting larger dimension happens to be the same dimension that is given in the description of the biblical city Foursquare that John the Revelator lays before us at the end of the Apocalypse, that describes mankind stepping away from all evil. Mary provided 144 challenging concepts as a fit challenge for mankind's scientific and spiritual self-development, the development of its power to step away from its foolish pursuits that have evil consequences. "I know the scene that you are talking about," said the man. "And I think I know why the woman hits the sex spot, and why she must hit it. The reason is reflected in the scene that we see behind the window. Through the window we see the society of mankind living in pairs, united by sex, but also deeply isolated from one another by sex. We see a scene of near universal isolation. And we are shown that sex is the key factor in the isolation. The isolation of society in two pairs bound by sex, but universally isolated by sex in two privatized entities, is a far cry from recognizing our universal humanity that binds us all into one unity, which should inspire a bond of universal love. In isolation our love becomes small, circumscribed, civilization fragile, and our economy precarious. In the scene that Mary presents, with us looking through the window into the mansion of mankind, we see a world devoid of universal love. Everybody is living in pairs unto themselves, existing as a singularity of two. Is this tiny singularity really sufficient to reflect the synergy of the female and male energies flowing into one, the Kama, that bids us to experience the divine completeness? The universality of love appears to be missing in that scene, if indeed there is any love reflected at all that one can't see portrayed. The synergy that reflects the divine has been made small, and has been privatized. That is evidently the reason why Mary's title for the scene is Truth versus Error. Something appears to be spiritually lacking when mankind is fractured into countless isolated singularities. The synergy of the divine union is being fractured and limited instead of being celebrated. Of course, it takes a big step from this fractured existence to a life and truth that erupts in universal celebration. To recognize and acknowledge the universal unity of all mankind, based on the simple fact that we are all first and foremost human beings, so that everything else is secondary, is evidently the toughest challenge that society is facing. We have evaded this challenge for centuries, and the empires have used the resulting void to insert their claim of power with which they dominate us in our self-isolation. The bottom line is that it requires the greatest resources that we can get our hands on to achieve a breakout from this trap. Mary tries to open the door for mankind with the truth, I interjected. She speaks of one truth, one principle, one human soul, and one mind in a synergy that reflects the divine. She alerts us that in this boundless quality of our humanity there is no isolation possible, or division, even sexual division, and all the other forms of division that we practice that are a denial of our divine humanity, and therefore a denial of God, the creative force and principle of the universe. Mary says that all life is divine, which precludes the elements of evil, hate, accidents, and decay that society tolerates and practices in its self-imposed smallness in thinking and acting. And she hits the sex spot with the door knocker, the one spot where the smallness rules society almost universally and is actually deemed bliss. This means that we have to go a long way yet to get back to where the Chandala people of India stood that had created the temples of Khajuraho, I interjected. I understand that the sculpted scenes of erotica in these temples weren't limited to groups of two people, if indeed the concept of limits applies. Don't we find the same breaking away from the pair concept of privatized living reflected in the Taj Mahal too? Said the man. I see no hint here of privatized sex, or any trace of the universal privatization of mankind that society is practicing in its small marriage spheres. But I see only a single dome crowning the Taj temple, said Indira. I see only one single female breast represented, even though that one is complete with an areola on top, and a nipple at the center in the form of the trident. That is a sacred Hindu motif, Indira interjected. My dear, look again, said the man. I see many breast images. I see one big dome that stands as a symbol at the center of the building. However, I also see this symbol being surrounded by numerous smaller individual reflections of it. Each one of the individual reflections is complete with an areola on top, and a nipple at the center of it and a trident sprouting from it. I see 4 such breast-shaped domes crowning the 4 cupolas at the 4 corners of the temple building. And I see 4 more such domes on the side buildings, 2 each with a larger dome in between them. This means I see a profusion of breasts, each with an areola and a trident for a nipple. This pattern is carried further and further, right to the very edge of the temple plaza and of the grounds of the Taj Mahal as a whole. The architectural feature of placing an areola on top of a breast-shaped dome is common to many Hindu temples. It appears to reflect the Shiva erotic background. One doesn't find this strongly suggestive symbolism incorporated into Islamic domes, since in the Muslim world the female form is strictly hidden from the view of society. It's unthinkable therefore that the form of a woman's breast becomes reflected in shape of the dome over a mosque. It would be a contradiction of the religion of Islam. But in Hinduism that symbolism is totally natural, especially for a Shiva temple. And the Shiva symbolism that I see here at the Taj Mahal also includes the male element in the same rich profusion. It wouldn't be a Shiva temple if the male element was missing. The synergy of the female and male energies that Shiva represents would be missing. But the synergy is not missing. It is profoundly reflected here. I see the male element incorporated in the form of 4 minarets, not just 1 or 2, as we find them in Islamic shrines, but 4 of them. Also the 4 minarets are perfectly aligned with the chamfered corners of the central building, which are topped with the 4 breast-crowned cupolas. We see an integrated design in which the chamfered corners extend the temple with a female-to-male interface that draws the male symbol of the minaret into the kind of complete synergy that comes to light as a joint sovereignty, which one would expect to see in the design of the Shiva temple. I don't think that this symbolism of the female and male synergy and its principle of joint sovereignty is matched anywhere in Islam. The synergy is a uniquely Hindu expression. Islam makes people ashamed of the human form, while we see it profoundly reflected here, almost everywhere. In addition to the 4 giant minarets, the 4 giant male symbols, I see 16 more miniature minarets that have been placed all around the top edge of the temple. This means that I see 20 male representations in total. Is that enough for a universal male representation? I would think it is enough. But there is another factor incorporated into the design of the Taj Mahal, which reflects the intention behind the vast female and male synergy. This factor is more readily apparent when one looks at the Taj Mahal in an aerial view from a space satellite. When one counts all the female symbols except the Great Dome, one counts 20 in total. 4 are a part of the central structure, and 16 are peripheral to it. This pattern corresponds with the 4 big male symbols being associated directly with central structure, and the 16 smaller ones taking on a peripheral role. The numeric coincidence was evidently not accidental, but reflects an intention in the design. The coincidence tell me that the 2 groups of symbols intentionally represent the male and female qualities, and their synergy. We are looking at a profound eroticism here. And even that is still not the end of the sexual pattern. Indira nodded. There is only one vulva spread out in the garden, she interjected. And a single giant breast towers high above it. Precisely so, said the man. Did you know that the giant vulva is located at the very center of the Taj Mahal grounds? The central location of the vulva is strikingly visible when the Taj Mahal is seen from space. It kind of hit me when I first saw a picture of the Taj Mahal transmitted from space. There it was right at the exact center of it all. The long narrow vertical pools are clearly symbolic of the slit of the vulva, complete with its widening at the center, and the celestial pool of abundance standing in the middle of it. And the two long pools that extend to the right and the left from the center are symbolic of a woman's inner thighs that lead towards the vulva. It's all there. Nothing is missing. The only aspect that one cannot find is a matching giant male symbol. It's the same with the giant breast-shaped dome of the central temple building. The dome is located at the exact center of the building. But one can't find a matching male symbol for it either. Why would this be? What do the designers acknowledge with this very clear and profound exception? I am a medical doctor, said Indira. I saw a study recently on the internet, in which researchers have proudly proclaimed that they discovered that women talk several times as much as men do, while men's thinking is several times as much centered on sex, when compared to women. Women vocalize their relationships more intensively while men visualize their relationships more intensely. Someone had commented on the internet that the researchers have finally discovered what has been commonly known for thousands of years. In this visual sphere in which the male relationship unfolds, or the male love so to speak, the sexual woman is the center of the image, and the vulva image is at the center of that. So it is not surprising that the female sexual features are profoundly represented in a temple visualization as well as in other forms of spiritual visualization. For example, John the Revelator visualized the spiritual image of mankind in the form of a woman clothed with the sun. The Revelator thereby acknowledged a natural specialized characteristic of our humanity. Mary echoed that acknowledgement when she wrote, as a part of her definition of the general term, man, that woman is the highest term for man. She later removed this statement, as it was evidently misunderstood, but she pioneered the concept that God must be recognized as a synergy of the female and male dimensions, and she adds that we have not as much authority for considering God as masculine than we have for considering God feminine, for the reason that the feminine dimension of love image is the clearest idea of deity, while the male dimension corresponds more with physical creation. In this context, we cannot say that the big female symbols of the breast and vulva that dominate the Taj Mahal as an image of love are not matched at the Taj Mahal. The match is found in the momentous physical structure that has been created so that the Taj Mahal comes to light as a synergy of creativity and love. That is probably the hardest aspect to recognize about the Taj Mahal, said the man. The reason is that the element of love has been so widely trashed by society, I interjected. Society has become spiritually throttled by imperial conditioning so that love doesn't count for much anymore, especially universal love, much less universal sexual love. Nevertheless, the need remains to recognize the universal marriage of mankind as human beings in all dimensions. The barriers against universal love are artificial, even against sexual love, as in the form of social division and sexual privatization. Mankind is a universal species that is wide and profound, not small and encumbered. That is what I see represented here in the design of the Taj Mahal. Unfortunately, much of that is missing in society, especially the universal dimension of love, said Indira. Some are fighting like hell to bring this lost element back, I said to Indira. I turned to the man. Have you seen the great art installation, The Dinner Party, by the American artist Judy Chicago? The man nodded. I saw it in New York, he said, and began to grin. Doesn't Judy Chicago present the same invitation that the Taj Mahal presents? I said to the man. Judy Chicago points out rather strikingly to society that the vulva is mankind's living erotic temple. The whole of mankind congregates there. It is the universal temple of the universal festival of Cunnilingus, and more, isn't it? All men go there, in general terms, even while society has trashed the image of the woman for millennia, socially, morally, and politically. Judy Chicago illustrates that society is sadly hypercritical and has been lying to itself for all those millennia in which the image of the woman has been trashed. The whole art installation has been designed to bring the missing honesty back, to resurrect the trashed female image, and with it the lost dimension of universal love. Isn't that what the builders of the Taj had already done 1,000 years ago? It's all here. Would we need to see more than a clear symbol of it? At the Taj, the vulva is huge. It's symbolic of an invitation to a great banquet. It is spread out across the entire garden that is comprised of 16 sections, reflecting the 16 parts of John City Foursquare, the very city that Mary later provided 144 definitions for us to explore the principles of civilization with. It is a huge invitation to a huge banquet, and it is all represented here by the vulva garden. It covers a huge field. Judy Chicago does the same. She sets a dinner table, a banquet for 39 of the greatest historic women, with each plate on the table bearing a representation of the vulva. She is saying to mankind, you are eating of the vulva, why can't you acknowledge the principle of universal love that your actions reflect, that you cannot get away from? Judy Chicago is saying, wake up, you hypocrites. You are depriving yourself of great riches by dishonoring half of mankind instead of embracing it. There is something that you might not be aware of, said the man. The 5 reflecting pools that together represent the vulva in the garden have not been intended to divide the garden into isolated sections, as it seems. Instead, the pools are water channels that are designed to water the garden. They are a part of an irrigation system to bring life into the garden. Isn't that synonymous with the effects of the universal vulva? I interrupted him. It doesn't divide mankind, but nourishes its soul. Its presence flows through the garden and into every part of it. I don't see this in terms of an orgy. I see it in terms of an universality that already touches everyone, that doesn't isolate anyone or any part of society. We do the isolating in our small-minded thinking contrary to our own nature. The universal vulva doesn't divide anything either. We create the divisions contrary to what we recognize in our heart to be true. Doesn't every married man and woman look across the fence at some time, and in some way, in spite of all the doctrines that forbid this, and would keep everything small? Don't even some people climb across those fences at great peril to their marriage and themselves? We are literally forcing ourselves to be dishonest with one another, and even with ourselves, and we call the resulting process morality, and the outcome a civilization. The symbolism of the Taj suggests strongly that society scrap its smallness and universal isolation. As far as I can tell, Mary suggests this too in her scene called Truth versus Error, where divine science knocks at the door of the mansion of mankind, and we see inside a society divided in 2 pairs, and living isolated from one another, and calling the outcome a civilization, joyously dancing and celebrating in the smallness of that isolation. Still, the critical factor here isn't a factor of mass. Mary said about this scene that mass means nothing. It's not a factor. The critical factor is obviously the universality of principle, the acknowledged universality of our humanity. That's the summoning factor. In her scene, society is summoned to acknowledge the truth of its universality. That is the same summons that Judy Chicago has put on the table. Except Mary raises the level of universality to the level of the divine universality of our humanity. We are not just equal to one another, but equal to the divine in our humanity. Isn't that also what the temples of Khajuraho represent, and what the Taj Mahal represents as a Shiva temple? There is one more factor that must also not be ignored, I said to the man. That's the factor of economy, which Shah Jahan would have known nothing about, who had made a parody of everything spiritual. The Prophet Muhammad might have known about it to some degree, but which got lost in perversion so deeply that the tiny Shah couldn't have even imagined it. And even now, much of it remains lost. But it hadn't been lost to the people that built the Taj Mahal. Like in the days when the temples of Khajuraho were built, which only a society with a great and efficient economy could have built, I see a similar profound sense of economy reflected in the Taj Mahal. The Taj wasn't built miserly and on the cheap. It was built by an economically rich society, a society that understood the principle of spiritual economics, which is the only principle of economics there is. Nothing less could have accomplished an achievement of this quality and beauty, on the scale that we see here. The Taj Mahal is a profound manifest of spiritual economics. That's what makes it one of the wonders of the world. The Hindu builders understood this principle, and so did Mary. "And this principle is?" said the man. "It is a very simple principle," I said. "The principle is to satisfy the needs of one another. In the temples of Khajuraho, the principle is illustrated in the sexual dimension. Of course, the process of satisfying the needs of one another dimensions as well. But it reflects the same divine principle. The principle of an economy, powered by love, is to satisfy one another's needs. An economy is not about money, but about satisfying the human need. If this principle isn't enacted, a society can have all the money in the world and still remain poor. An economy is about physical production powered by technology that extends mankind's productivity. Money doesn't produce anything. Human beings do that. Money needs to be created as credit to society in such quantities as is necessary to meet the human need. In this sense, money becomes a lubricator that facilitates the functioning of the productive process, while the process itself is powered by the spiritual qualities of intelligence and love manifest in the vitality of the human spirit and the dimension of its science. That's how the productive process works. That's how an economy works. And the overriding principle is always to meet the human need. And the human need is far greater than just to maintain a simple biological existence. Our humanity demands expressions of freedom and the power to overcome limits. That's what defines a civilization. We have created a civilization with such a productive power that we created ourselves the freedom to travel to the stars and enrich the earth in such measures that we can now support 1,000 times larger population than we could support without the human productivity of our spiritual economy. Money as credit expands the productive capacity of our humanity, while the result of the production in turn attributes some corresponding value to money. Theta, the wealth of society, therefore isn't money, but is the productive capacity of our humanity. We could achieve the same wealth totally without money by some other regulating process. This means that divinity of the human being is the key factor in creating society's wealth. An economy is therefore a spiritual construct. Real economics is a spiritual metaphysical process. The whole of mankind lives by resources today that don't exist naturally, but were created by intelligent means. Spiritual economics is creativity in motion. It's the only form of economics there is. The underlying science of economics is divine science. We see some of that reflected in the Hindu concept of kama, said Indira. It rests on the principle of meeting one another's need at the sexual grassroots level, which evidently also spills over into all the other aspects of spiritual economics. Of course, the economics of divine science has nothing to do with money. Jesus stated in many ways that rich man in money, who leached his riches from society's living, cannot enter heaven. He suggested that a universally rich society is heaven. That is what I see reflected in his parable of the Good Samaritan. In the parable, a man that was robbed and injured is left by the wayside to die. A priest comes that way, he observes, but walks by, likewise a member of the elite. Next comes a real human being. He binds up the man's wounds and takes him to an inn, and takes care of him. Which of the three lives in the richest world? Asked Indira. Which world would you want to live in? The priest was too poor to give a damn. The elite was too stingy to give a dime. But the human being was rich. He poured wine in the wounds of the injured man, and put down whatever else was needed. He not only saved the man's life and his productive capacity, but he created a richly human world. In doing so, isn't that the kind of world in which we all want to live? That's the beginning of divine economics, where the human being is valued as the greatest asset a society has. It is a world of metaphysics taking us beyond physics, I commented in the way Mary would. It is crisp music tone, it's heaven's hymn. I suggested that divine economics is nothing more than the divine challenge of truth versus the deadening sense of finity and limitation that encumbers every aspect of a small-minded society that has been put asleep with imperial dreams and empty ideals. I take it that much of the modern society qualifies for this description, said the man, including the American society. I just laughed. The USA carries a combined debt, public, corporate, and private, of about $50 trillion. That is going up and up while the physical economy is far below the break-even point and is rapidly collapsing under this load. We are running a show of negative economics, or counter-economics. Unfortunately, nobody is interested in real economics. We have lost so much of our productive industries to slave labor countries that we can only maintain ourselves as an importer society piling up debt. We are bankrupt. We need a bankruptcy reorganization. We need a fresh start. What good would that do? Said the man, and now laughed too. A fresh start would only mean something if you made a commitment to go back to real economics, to divine economics, in which the human being is the greatest asset a society has, and everything else is secondary to maintaining this asset and improving this asset. That's the real human need. Mankind's place in the universe is not to scrape up a few scraps to keep the biological system alive. Mankind's place in the universe is to improve the universe. Our place in the universe is to give life a new dimension, a dimension of intelligence that engenders a completely new dimension of power, freedom, beauty, and creativity. Our future isn't starvation, but created abundance. And the process for this created abundance in divine economics isn't winding down like clock, but is winding up. It is anti-entropic. We are on a non-linear pathway to infinity. Look at energy use as an example. We started with wood fires probably a few ice ages ago. Then, as intelligence became a greater power, we jumped to coal, then to oil, then to nuclear fission, with nuclear fusion standing on the horizon and antimatter energy on the far distant horizon. But with each step we opened up vast resources of an unimaginable abundance. At today's rate of energy use, all wood would be used in a day, while nuclear fission gives us enough resources for 10,000 years, and nuclear fusion forever without end. Still, our mission is not to adapt the universe to our needs, but to improve the universe. That is our need. For all ages to the present, great ice ages have decimated all life on this planet. Only a few million people came out of the last ice age. Our need is to create the technological infrastructures that not only enable us to get through the next ice age, with possibly 10 billion people supplied by indoor agriculture, but to expand throughout the next 100,000-year ice age, and come out of it with a greater quality of life than ever before. We literally take on the role of active agents of the creative principle of life, and move forward with it and people the universe. That is what I call divine science economics, the kind of economics that is built on the science of the divinity of our humanity. This spiritual science has been gradually dawning. But even then it created wonders. Our civilization begun probably as early as 8,000 years ago, but the vast majority of the advances were only made in the last 800 years. That's the spiritual dynamics of anti-entropy. Can you imagine where we have the potential to be in the next 50 years, and then extend this across the next 100,000 years? Of course, all of that depends on one thing, I interjected. It depends on us recognizing ourselves as human beings, an intelligent and creative species with a divine, universal humanity. And for that we aren't even at the starting gate anymore. We are stuck in the rut with $50 trillion in debt. The man just nodded. That is why I told you that nothing will be resolved with a global bankruptcy reorganization that is intended to give mankind merely a new start. A new start only makes sense when society decides to step up to the starting gate for it. This means starting at the grassroots level, as the Hindus did 1,000 years ago at the time when the temples of Khajuraho were built. Society has to begin to discover its humanity and the power of the principle of universal love meeting one another's need. Stepping to the starting gate means stepping away from oligarchic control, imperial processes, imperial notions, imperial pomp and power, including monetary wealth, that isn't wealth at all, but is an agent of poverty. So, my friends, is America willing to step up to the starting gate? If you answer yes, all the technicalities for the needed bankruptcy reorganization will fall into place as required for divine science economics. If, as the other alternative, you answer no, America is doomed, and the world with it, regardless of what reorganization you might attempt, and might even carry out. The key to rescuing our civilization then lies with stepping up to the starting plate of divine science economics, Indira repeated, speaking with a tone of astonishment. The key is society's principled commitment to its spiritual universal humanity, I added. That involves the principle of universal love. The man nodded and smiled. I see we understand something that virtually no one else on the planet understands, said the man. That is also why we understand that the Taj Mahal is indeed the greatest temple to love ever built. The Taj Mahal takes us to the staring gate. Mary's work takes us the rest of the way. Understanding this and acknowledging this makes us one of a kind, my friends, and a rather rare phenomenon indeed in this small-minded world. The man reached his hand out for a handshake. I'm glad to have met you people, he added while we shook hands. We both said that we're glad to. He nodded again, and then simply walked away. He disappeared into the crowd as abruptly as he had come to us. Was that real? I asked Indira moments later, or was I dreaming all of this? It was real, though it shouldn't have been, said Indira. There are too few people like him around. We should have asked for his address. I shrugged my shoulders. Is there a need for it? He told us what he knows. What would we benefit by meeting him again? He is an interesting man, but he too lives passively. He knows a lot, but I don't sense that he is struggling to change the world with what he knows. And so, he might just waste our time with any further contact. I would sooner work with a person who struggles to implement a single profound idea and is moving heaven and earth to uplift civilization with it than knowing 10 persons with 1,000 ideas who are not committed to do anything with them. So I must ask myself, would Fred hire the man who talked to us? I don't think he would. Indira agreed, reluctantly. We stayed all of the rest of the day at the Taj Mahal. There was a reason for it. Before taking the train back, just as nightfall began, we wanted to observe the dramatic change in light and color that the travel guide promised would alter the appearance of the Taj Temple Palace. The guide promised that the Taj would sparkle like a jewel in the moonlight, as the semi-precious stones that were inlaid into the white marble would begin to capture the light of the moon, and the building itself would take on a golden hue. Unfortunately, we were denied to witness the spectacular sight. A cloud-covered ruin from the south, and changed our plans. The Taj appeared ever more milky white in the unfolding evening. Before we left, people say that in the early morning sun the Taj glows a beautiful pink as it catches the hue of the dawn mixed with the first rays of sunlight, said Indira. She commented on it as we were back on the train. Perhaps she was right, though. And so, perhaps we should stay overnight on our next visit. But then the thought came that did it really matter that we couldn't see these trivial things? I realized with a great sense of gratitude that I had already seen a great deal more that day than I had ever expected to see, and vastly more than most visitors would ever open their eyes to. The rest was unimportant in comparison. I realized, as the lights of the city of Agra receded in the distance, that we might be coming away from this place a great deal richer than most tourists ever had. That night, back home in our flat on the 17th floor, I dreamed about the Taj, about India, and about my love that had become ever more intertwined with Indira's. The dream images also became intertwined with another into an all-embracing maze of wonderfully complex issues centered on universal love and universal sovereignty, and of course, universal marriage, our forever universal unity in being. I even argued in my dream with the great master of Christianity about his comment that seemed to counter some of what we saw. At least in my dream I argued with him in defending our newfound vision of a humanist truth. An image of a scene appeared in which the great master was addressing a crowd, where he said that whosoever is looking at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I struggled endlessly with this paradox, as one does in dreams, countering the great master. Strangely, I was the only one who spoke. I spoke for him. I explained to myself that his comment on lust was meant to be a two-edged parody. The parody is both a parody about the old law that the master had always opposed, by which the slightest expanding sense of love is totally forbidden. The parody also became an indictment of the adulteration of the divine law, which the false law represented. His comment certainly wasn't an indictment of the principle of universal love, which I acknowledged the great master would never condemn. In my dream the master always silently nodded without comment, as if I had to discover the truth for myself out the depth of my intelligent humanity. I also affirmed to myself that he actually never spoke a single word against love itself when he made this comment. He spoke against lust that involves exploitation, theft, and slavery, the opposite of love. These forms of lust that are really rape are evidently just as much a perversion of the principle of universal love as is any perversion of religion, like the perversion of Islam that had destroyed and desecrated Hindu temples all across India. I argued that we have the power to roll back history and set the record straight. With this profound and startlingly affirmation I awoke. I awoke joyously to a wonderfully bright day, and to Indra's equally bright smile when I joined her on the balcony. The conflicting paradox of a mulling dream was left behind in the night, and instantly forgotten in the sunshine. "I greet you, and I kiss you forever," I said to her. We both said our greeting almost in unison, as I joined her in the sunshine. She handed me a plate without saying another syllable. On the plate was her special bread, that she had promised me at the Taj, that she had already baked while I was still sleeping, a kind of pancake the size of the plate itself, covered with sweet marinated fruits. I think my friend Steve would ask me at this point if I really understand what I am doing here, I said to her, as I made myself comfortable at the table. He might ask if I understand the breakthrough that we have started to make for humanity. Breakthrough? Indira repeated. I nodded. Everything about you, about your smile, your gestures, about this place, the very air that we breathe, says we are enveloped in love, both of us together. Isn't that a breakthrough? But Steve might argue that it isn't, because that's how it normally should be among human beings, and always should have been. On the other hand, we are becoming enveloped with a kind of universal love that none of the sages in India's ancient past had been able to give a name to describe it. Love is the father and the mother of the universe, manifest in profound principles unfolding into a flow of good. In a very real sense, therefore, we are the sons and daughters of the divine reality that has no name, but which is love, whose image we bear, in which we find our very soul, the one divine soul that we all share universally in individual being. The Apostle John understood something of that when he said that God is love, and suggested that we haven't got the faintest idea what God is until we love. Mary said the same thing in a different way, in more scientific terms. She said that because God is love, God, or love, must be understood as divine principle, a universal principle that encompasses humanity and the universe, which cannot be limited. Any denial of it would be a denial of oneself and of reality altogether. Right, said Indira and smiled. She proceeded to pour me some more tea. What you are saying completely revolutionizes all religions, including all the marriage customs that are in effect today. It appears that we have already begun this revolution in our lives. I began to laugh suddenly. This would be funny if it were not so profound, I said to her. We have talked about this a couple of days ago, she said, have we not? But this was just a step. Our challenge is to invite humanity to meet us at this higher level. Our challenge is to uplift it. Indeed, we have talked about this, I replied, but we did not realize in that taking this step also revolutionizes the image of humanity itself. If God is love, and we are the sons and daughters of this one universal divine reality, or the image of it, we are by design the very image of love itself. Isn't that a beautiful image to bear, and to embrace, and to be proud of, and to project into life? And so, My friend Steve would say that this isn't revolutionary either. He might ask why it should be deemed to be revolutionary to live like a human being. Isn't that also what the early Veda tries to convey when it says that God can have no name, or love can have no name, or else all names apply? That's something a human being would understand. Steve would call any denial of this vast and wonderful scope of truth an act of self-denial, since we are a part of the divine reality and give our individual name to it. He would say that any form of pulling ourselves away from it amounts to self-isolation, meaning the isolation of ourselves from our humanity. That kind of living is what we had called normal. But when this self-denial and self-isolation ends all around the world, so that all the wars will end with it and the universal welfare of humanity will be established, we call the new state phenomenal and revolutionary. And maybe that is why the world is still at war, because we say to ourselves that we can be happy with far less than what is divinely natural. In other words, you are saying that what we are involved in right now is revolutionizing the image of humanity to a level of truth that we should have embraced ages ago. Is that what you are saying? Indira asked. Indira spoke slowly, as if she needed time for letting this idea unfold, like the petals of a flower that is greeted by the morning sun. Indeed, this was precisely what was happening that morning. A new image of ourselves was unfolding in the bright morning sunshine on Indira's balcony high above the old city of Delhi. The night was receding. The sunshine was becoming normal. A sunrise had begun. I told her, while I was eating her bread with her, our special morning meal that she had prepared, that I finally was beginning to understand what John the biblical revelator might have beheld when he described the image of a woman clothed with the sun. John saw in it not a new image that never existed before, but the eternal image that has always existed, but was breaking through the clouds and mist. He saw humanity enveloped in love, as if it was clothed with the sun. He saw an ageless reality coming to light in which he could glean the final end of all evil. He also saw the woman clothed with the sun, wearing a crown of 12 stars on her head, which symbolized joy, the stars of rejoicing. I suggested to Indira that we were beginning to experience John's image of humanity in ourselves, the enveloping love that illumines like the sun crowned with the crown of the stars of rejoicing as we find the heavens of truth. Why make it so complicated? Said Indira. You can say the same thing and more in one single short sentence. I would say it this way: love has laid a great banquet before us. What more does one need to acknowledge? Indira's response was celebrated with me embracing her with a long-lasting embrace, followed with a kiss that ended with a smile that outshone the sunshine.